Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I know you like me telling stories and I can go on doing it all the time, but that is not cut the clutter. Cut the clutter occasionally, maybe once in a few months, I do storytelling. And that is when a cluttered story, a particularly cluttered story finds a present context. So see what has happened in Uttarakhand right now with this landslide or glacier burst, in a sense, the disaster in the river. Now what's happened is there are many theories. Among the many theories also is something that I have seen over the last 3 days, that it could be caused in some ways by a nuclear monitoring device that in the mid-60s, Indian climbers working for Intelligence Bureau and the CIA had left at the foot of the Nanda Devi massif. And I also saw an interview on one of the TV channels where Captain M.S. Kohli, who was the commander of this mission, but also he's a famed Indian mountaineer. He was also the captain of the first successful Indian climb on the Everest in 1965. So he said, I can't rule out that this has happened because of this. At the same time, I have no confirmation, and he described what this piece of equipment was like and how much energy it contained. So first of all, let me get some facts out of the way, because if it really was a case of a plutonium device causing release of a lot of energy and that energy getting the glacier to break, etc., then we would have seen a lot of radioactivity by now. So there is no need to spread panic. Right now, unless you find radioactivity anywhere, and I'm sure people are checking there and keeping track, you cannot attribute it to the device. What it does, however, is because this device was in the same neighborhood where this break of the rock or the glacier or whatever has taken place, and also because this has been mentioned and discussed, this gives me the opportunity to tell you a bunch of very interesting stories. Now, how did this story first came into the Indian consciousness? If this was a mission between the CIA and Intelligence Bureau, remember in mid-60s there was no RAW. There was only the IB. IB did all the intelligence work, domestic and international, and the legendary IB chief B.N. Malik was in command. He served as IB chief for 14 years, and I will tell you about him also. So this operation was carried out. This remained a secret. In 1979, in fact on 15th of April 1979, late Kuldeep Nayyar broke a story on the front page of the Indian Express. It was a lead story in the Indian Express where he talked about this nuclear device that he said the Indian and American climbers or joint American-Indian mission had taken to Nanda Devi and had left it there, and it was lost since then. And that recently then, that's the reason the story broke, Indian Air Force had sent a special helicopter mission to look for this device. And how do you look for this device from a helicopter? 1979 technology was not so developed, but Geiger counters were always there. So look for radiation and whatever technical means were available to search for the device. In fact, this device was at such an altitude that normal helicopters of Indian Air Force were not capable of going up to those altitudes. So these helicopters were modified. In fact, I also know the pilots of the helicopters, but I shall not mention their names even now. Anyway, so Kuldeep Nayyar broke this story. And then there was a bit of controversy. There was some discussion in parliament, but no side wanted to make a big deal of it because everybody knew what it was about. Because in 1964, the Chinese had tested their first nuclear weapons. As that happened, everybody got worried. India got really worried because India was next door and India had just lost a war to the Chinese in 1962. China and Pakistan were becoming close friends, and the Americans were very concerned about the Chinese nuclear program. So the idea was to plant this device at a place in the Himalayas where it's high enough to pick up information, signals, radiation, whatever, from the Tibet side if there was any nuclear activity, particularly going as far as Lop Nor. Now you remember that there is geography involved, there is geography and geology involved, which is that you may be sitting anywhere, you may be a little higher than some place, but still there is a limit to how far you can look. Look at the sea, for example. You may sit on one of these high chairs on which lifeguards sit, but even then you can see into the horizon only up to a distance. After that, the curvature of the earth comes in the way and you can't see more. So the higher you are, the further you can look and the further you can monitor. So the idea was to put this device high as possible. Second, once you left a device, you had to forget it because you were not going to link it to a generator, or you were not going to link it to a diesel power plant, or you were not going to take a mains line from the planes. It's not possible at those altitudes. So this had to have a source of energy that will last more or less forever. So as Captain Kohli said in his TV interview just last week, he said that the batteries that this device had radioactive material to last them 100 years, which means the batteries could still be there. So this device was to be planted. So what happened was that this device was taken by Indian climbers, because no American climbers were allowed to go on this trek. Indian climbers, India's ace Himalayan climbers went on this trek, and I will give you their names. What happened was, this was a little late. 1965 was the successful Indian Everest mission. This was towards the end of the climbing season in 1965 that they went to Nanda Devi. As they went to Nanda Devi, they were still at the base camp when a blizzard struck the base camp. So heavy was the blizzard that they had to come back from there. And what did they do when they were coming back? They said that this is very heavy equipment. This was dismantled in pieces. So these climbers were separately carrying these pieces. Now to carry it back and to take it up. And they also had a communication engineer, Mr. Bhangu, I will tell you about him, whose job it would have been then to put these pieces together and to get this equipment functional by joining the various pieces. So what they did was, they put this equipment or its pieces under some kind of shelter and protection and came back, thinking that this is the base camp, we know where it is. Next climbing season, because this climbing season is ending, next climbing season we will come back, again find this and haul it up to Nanda Devi. What happened was, when they came in the next year, they found those equipment pieces were not there. So presumption was that they had been swept away by an avalanche. So since then the belief is that this equipment is lost, but there is always a fear that maybe it's sitting somewhere there. One day will start leaking radiation, can pollute the entire Ganga system. I mean, that is an alarmist view, but still there is a lot of radioactivity there. So that equipment is lying somewhere there. Has it died? Has it been crushed? Has it been destroyed? We don't know. And that is why this theorizing, every time something happens in those Himalayas, these theories come back, that maybe it is that IBCIA equipment which had disappeared, that has gone rogue. But once again, there is no scientific evidence. Now, I told you I'm doing storytelling, so I will do storytelling. So this story surfaced in 1979, 15th April, as I said, with Kuldeep Nayyar's Newsbreak. Then it died out a little bit. Then in 1983, when I came to Delhi to work with India Today magazine, this story again came up in some ways, because what the Americans have, they have a good habit or a bad habit, very good for journalists. They keep declassifying even their high security stuff in the course of time. So they were declassifying more stuff in early 80s. Among those declassified documents were also two references. One reference was to how America sought India's help, and Nehru agreed to set up a U-2 spy plane base in India to spy over the Tibetan mountains across into China, because India had no way of knowing what was going on in China, and at that point satellites were not the instrument for doing this. You needed high altitude spy planes, and you know, Americans had these big huge spy planes which could fly very high, go long distances. In fact, one of those was shot down over Soviet Union, and its pilot Gary Powers was taken prisoner as well. That was a famous incident. So the story was, did the Americans set up this base in India. So Indrajit Badwar, who used to be the Washington correspondent then of India Today, he broke this story from Washington from these documents. And I was following up this story in Delhi at a time when we were also writing a cover story on a big spying espionage story scandal called the Larkins spy scandal. And I will tell you about that. So Larkins spy scandal, because foreign agencies were involved, and the Larkins brother, one a major general, one an air vice marshal, who apparently were working with the CIA and French intelligence to take out blueprints and manuals of India's MiG series aircraft to sell to them for money. They had been arrested. So while we were doing that, these intelligence operations were in the news, and that is when this YouTube story came out. As the YouTube story came out, once again new references came out of this IB CIA operation, because already by 1983 people had forgotten that there was a time when CIA and the Indian intelligence, in that case Intelligence Bureau, were running joint operations targeted at the Chinese, because our impression has been, and our generation in particular, and even more so generations after us, have seen America as a Cold War adversary. They have not thought of America as an ally of a certain crucial period in India's history. So I went following up on this story, and who did I reach out to? I reached out to a gentleman called Mr. B.N. Malik, whose name I just mentioned to you. B.N. Malik, as I mentioned to you, was the Intelligence Bureau chief for 14 years, and he worked under Nehru, and really was a scholarly man, very controversial. His trilogy, he wrote 3 books on the time he spent with Nehru. So his trilogy is one of the most definitive accounts of Indian politics, India's security situation, Kashmir problem between 1948 and mid-60s or late 60s until he was there. So his trilogy is called 3 books. My Years with Nehru, 1948-64, because Nehru died in 64, 27th May. Second, My Years with Nehru, the Chinese betrayal. That is how the Chinese betrayed India, although B.N. Malik was also blamed for intelligence failure. And third, My Years with Nehru, just Kashmir. So if you can find these on libraries, these are out of print, please check these out. These are great books. So I called him and he took my call, and he said, okay, come and meet me. And he gave me the address. So I went to meet him. It was in Vasant Vihar in Delhi. And I stopped in front of a house, nice house, a Vasant Vihar house. I was on my motorbike. But I was a bit surprised because I thought I'd come to the wrong address. The number was right, but the nameplate said H.A. Barari, B-A-R-A-R-I. Now, H.A. Barari, I knew at that point, was number 2 in the Intelligence Bureau. He later rose to become the Director of Intelligence Bureau. So I said, I'm coming to B.N. Malik's house. Why have I landed up at H.A. Barari's house? So I was still looking, sort of peeping into the house, that I saw an old man in a golf cap sitting in a lounge chair. And he said, come in, young man, park your motorbike outside, come inside, you are in the right place. So this was Mr. B.N. Malik, the legendary Mr. B.N. Malik. As we discovered, Mr. Barari was his foster son-in-law. So I sat with him, and a lot of the older people, when they find young reporters coming to them long into their retirement, they also love to tell stories. So he engaged with me on this story, both on Nanda Devi's story and the YouTube story. So I will tell you the YouTube story first. I told you there is clutter in this, because my immediate context for reaching out to him was the YouTube story. And linked to that was Nanda Devi, because I also wanted to ask him how closely did the IB under him work with the CIA, and what was the trust level between us, India, and the CIA, because that is not something that people remember very well. People have seen the CIA always to be an adversary, except lately now India and America call each other their strategic allies. So this is different. Post-Vajpayee, history has changed. Anyway, so he said yes, America had proposed to Nehru, and America had done this through John Kenneth Galbraith, who was America's ambassador to India and who had Nehru's ear. So he had gone to Nehru and he had said that, look, we all need to know what's happening on the Chinese side across the Himalayas, particularly on their nuclear programs, but also on their military movements. We have no way of knowing, and you have no way of knowing. So if we find out, we can tell you. And the Chinese had concerns about Americans coming in from the Pakistan side at that point. In fact, it's one of those funny Cold War stories, because American U-2 aircraft those days were flying from Peshawar over China, but from there the Tibetan region is too far. In fact, Gary Powers, who got shot down over Soviet Union, had flown from Peshawar. That led to a big threat also from the Soviets to Pakistan, but we are going deep into the Cold War. Let's come back to India. So the place they chose, the Americans wanted to choose for this joint operations, surveillance or airborne surveillance or spying mission, was a place called Charbatia in Odisha. It was an airstrip, an air base had to be built there. So in general, Nehru was open to it, but he balked a little bit because he wasn't sure this was the right thing to do. Because suddenly for India to have joint intelligence operations with America, coming out of at the peak of the Cold War, coming out of India's obsession, Nehru's obsession with non-alignment, this was tough. So Malik said that he sent Galbraith to meet Malik. He came to meet Malik. Malik also fobbed him off. And then as Nehru was persuaded even more, Malik said, okay, you can do it, you can allow it, but on one condition, that when they bring back their film, so these are pre-digital age, you had to shoot these things in long spools of film. When they bring back the film, the lab to process the film should also be set up at Charbatia, and India should have equal access to all those pictures in real time, not that they will go to Langley, Virginia, and then they will send back to you what they want to give to you. So Nehru insisted on that. Galbraith again said, look, that is too much work, miles and miles of film will come. How are we going to process it? How are we going to set up a lab this size? But Nehru insisted that they do it, and then Malik told me that this was not done. It was later, I will come back to Nanda Devi, because stories are linked and cluttered, like all spy stories. So I also thought that, all right, this had not happened, that this was planned but did not happen, convinced by the old man. So the other thing that B.N. Malik told me was that T.T. Krishnamachari, he was a minister in Nehru's cabinet. He was now Minister for Economy and Defense Coordination. He was one of the very few pro-Western ministers in Nehru's cabinet. So he had gone to America on a visit. So Americans also reached out to him to get him to persuade Nehru to allow this base at Charbatia to come up. And he sent a long cable from Washington to Nehru, persuading him to say yes. He said Nehru just ticked him off and told him to mind his own business. But as I will tell you, later I discovered there was a surprise. Something indeed had happened there. In 2013, in Indian Express, when I was the editor, Manu Pabbi, who was our stellar defense reporter, he wrote a wonderful story. It was a scoop, again based on declassified American documents, saying that some flights of U-2s had indeed taken place from Charbatia. Definitely one on May 23, 1964. Remember, that's a very significant date. And so my first reaction was that, oh, that means the old man, B.N. Malik, sold me a dummy. But he was an intelligence man. It was his job to sell me a dummy. He didn't want, particularly in 1983, for it to come out that these flights had actually been carried out. And also maybe because he was such a Nehru loyalist, he wanted to also protect Nehru's reputation. It so happened that 23rd of May 1964 was the first such flight. 27th of May 1964, within 4 days of this, Nehru died. As Nehru died, this joint Charbatia operation also faded, it seems. Charbatia remains an airborne surveillance, airborne intelligence operations base even now. In fact, ARC, Aviation Research Center, which is a kind of a unit of RAW, operates from there, and they have a bunch of aircraft with special equipment and electronics, etc. This is no secret. This is a well-known public fact. So that was the story of Charbatia. So what it does is, it sets into perspective the period when India and America were working so close together against a common threat, that was China. So the Americans proposed that we have create this nuclear powered device, which if we can put high enough on the Himalayas, can look deep enough into the Chinese side, maybe not as far as Lopnor, where the Chinese test sites were, because by that time maybe the curvature of the earth will come in the way, but far enough for us to know what is going on. So proposed that this be set up at Kanchenjunga. So rest of the story we know from a wonderful Indian climber, a star Indian climber called Captain M.S. Kohli. Captain M.S. Kohli, he's the one who spoke to TV last week. Captain M.S. Kohli was the captain of the Indian successful Everest mission. He did not do the summit, but his team did the summit. He was the captain of the climbing team. He also was in charge of this operation at Nanda Devi. So he wrote a book later, and that's another book that's currently available that you should look for at some point. I borrowed a copy from him, called Spies in the Himalayas, Secret Missions and Perilous Climbs. So that book has an account of this climb as well. This book was published by University of Kansas. Captain Kohli was captain not as in the army, captain as in the navy, which is a much higher rank. After that, he was seconded to Indo-Tibetan Border Police, because climbing was his passion, not seafaring so much as climbing, and then doing adventurous things. So he tells you in that book that in this expedition, he had India's best, the finest climbers. Because he said first the Americans said that we want to go to Kanchenjunga. So Americans took these Indian climbers who were all affiliated with Intelligence Bureau. So they were all seconded out to intelligence operations. India has been good at this stuff, believe me. So they were taken to Alaska by the CIA to be trained by CIA's climbers at their school. And they were also made familiar with this equipment and how this equipment works, how to dismantle it, how to put it back together. So he said that we were trained and we were told to go to Kanchenjunga. But he said he told them that, look, Kanchenjunga is too high for us to be carrying this, because by that time it's a tough peak to climb, much tougher, it's much higher altitude, but we will not be able to take it up. Even if we take it up, somehow we will not have the energy left at that point to put these pieces together to make a functional piece out of these dismantled pieces. So he persuaded the Americans that if you go to Kanchenjunga, you have only a 1 in 4 chances of succeeding. He suggested instead a peak called Nanda Kot in Uttarakhand Himalayas. But the Americans then said, CIA said, that's fine, we know it's an easier peak, but the altitude is not enough. I'll give you the altitudes. But the altitude is not enough. It was then that Captain Kohli suggested that they go to Nanda Devi instead. So if you look at these massives, these peaks, then I will tell you the altitudes, but you can also look at the mountain map. So Nanda Kot is 22,150, high but not high enough to look deep enough inside Tibet. Then Kanchenjunga would have been the best, 28,169 feet, but again degree of difficulty was too high. So as a compromise, Captain Kohli suggested Nanda Devi, which was 25,643 feet. So what Captain Kohli did was, he picked up the best Indian climbers. There were Sonam Gyatso, who he calls the finest Indian climber ever. Sonam Gyatso, Harish Rawat, Sonam Wangyal, and also G.S. Bhangu. G.S. Bhangu was a communication officer who was seconded out to Intelligence Bureau. So I wrote an article about this. I write an occasional series called First Person Second Draft. When I revisit some stories I might have done in detail in the past where new things come up, so I have a story to tell retrospectively. So I wrote this piece in 2013, and which I updated later, and I am sharing that with you as a link. You can read that. So I called Captain Kohli then, and he told me about his book, etc. But he also told me, I asked him, what mistake did you make? Did we make any mistake as to why this device was lost? He said, yes, we made one mistake. We trusted the Americans and CIA, their knowledge and expertise too much. We should have relied more on our own knowledge and understanding. Now, what that is, you can ask him. Maybe he will talk more in detail about that. We will know. He also told me a delightful story of how Sonam Gyatso, who was the finest climber, he says, who he ranks as the finest Indian climber, he said he had one weakness, which is not unique, alcohol. And the delightful story he tells is that supplies for them were being airdropped in the mountains when they were on the climb. And one of those supply missions also brought them crates of American beer. And it so happened as the crates were dropped, they broke and cans of beer spread out. And Sonam Gyatso thought it was too much of a waste to leave this behind. So he started drinking them, and he could only be stopped when he was on his number 9 or number 10. Of course, Captain Kohli goes on to tell me that in 1983, Sonam Gyatso died of cirrhosis of the liver. Now that we're telling you stories, I will top it up with one more spying story. Again, not exactly related to this, but that's how spying stories work out. Now, what was this Larkins scam in 1983? This was one of the first stories I did when I joined India Today in Delhi. So it was in 1983, towards the winter, that Major General Frank and Air Vice Marshal Kenneth Larkins, both brothers, senior officers, both were arrested for spying. And what was the charge? That they were trying to steal or buy manuals of the various versions of MiG aircraft with the Indian Air Force and passing them on to the French and the American intelligence. In fact, the French military attaché at that point had also withdrawn from India. So it was in the maze of this complex spying, espionage stuff that I also got onto the Charbatia story. But what was the Larkin story? I will tell you in 2 minutes. So these two brothers, senior officers, they were under suspicion, living beyond their means or doing something, some hanky-panky. So Indian Air Force and intelligence set up a trap for them. This trap was being monitored directly by Mrs. Gandhi, by Indira Gandhi. What happened then was that they selected one Air Vice Marshal, an Air Vice Marshal S. Raghavendran, who was in the Air Headquarters. He was a decoy, the chief decoy. There was a deputy decoy under him who was a serving group captain, and in a minute I will tell you who he was. He was a serving group captain, also a MiG pilot, a MiG veteran. So the trap was that Air Vice Marshal Raghavendran would start pretending that he was disgruntled, he was upset, he was bored with his desk job, he was fed up with life. So soon enough, and he had worked under Air Vice Marshal Larkins earlier, so there was quite a bit of familiarity there. So in the course of time, he got approached by the Larkins brothers with the offer, saying that if you give us manuals of MiG-23 aircraft, we'll give you 30,000 rupees. So that job was given to the group captain to do it. It was all being done as part of a trap. And when finally he was to turn over this so-called manuals, obviously not genuine or whatever it was, to the Larkinses, Mrs. Gandhi was informed and she gave permission for this operation. So this decoy operation was carried out, and then many more such operations were carried out. These were all monitored by our own counterintelligence people. Finally, the Larkins brothers were arrested and convicted and given long sentences. Frankly, I don't know what happened to them after that. Now, finally, who was the group captain, the MiG pilot, MiG-21 pilot, who was the decoy who carried out this very difficult and tricky job? His name then was Group Captain Jasjeet Singh. He rose to be Air Vice Marshal Jasjeet Singh, among our finest strategic thinkers, also a director of IDSA, Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, also served after that as consultant editor for strategic affairs for us at the Indian Express on our opinion pages. So that is how you find these espionage stories work out and they get interlinked.